July 14, 1945, midday near Gainesville, Texas. The sun was brutal. Not a battlefield sun, not the smoky haze of war-torn skies, but a dry, brilliant Texas blaze that bleached the horizon and burned the earth beneath it. The dust rose in shimmering heat waves off the cracked red soil. Cicadas buzzed loud and constant, like 1,000 broken field radios screeching in sync. From the back of a swaying army truck, a group of 33 Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and widows of ranking soldiers, clutched tightly to the wooden slats along the side of the cargo bed. Their beige cotton uniforms were already darkened under the arms and backs, streaked with the salt of old sweat. Most hadn't spoken for the last hour of the drive. The silence wasn't from fear anymore. It was something else, something brittle, tight as wire, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. They'd been in America for almost 2 months now, captured in the Marianas, processed through a port in California, then like cattle on rails shipped inland far from cities, far from war. Now Texas, whatever that meant. The truck lurched to a stop on a dirt road that seemed to vanish into dry nothing. The women, clutching what few belongings they had, wooden toothbrushes, fabric canteens, photos of sons they hadn't heard from in over a year, looked out. They expected another fence, another line of tents or barracks, maybe armed guards barking English at them, but what they saw instead, what hit them first, was the smoke. Thick white columns drifted upward from the ground ahead, curling over an open grove of mesquite trees. For a brief, terrible second, several women clutched their sleeves to their mouths. Some squinted in panic. Fire, gas, incinerators. But then came the smell. Not the harsh chemical tang of death they feared, not the scent of oil or gunpowder. No. Meat. Rich, thick, slow-roasted meat. Fat rendered over heat. Spice, smoke, sweetness. Something primal, seductive, impossible. It didn't make sense. Their stomachs, empty since dawn, responded before their minds could catch up. Eyes widened, nostrils flared. A few women glanced at each other in confusion. One whispered, "Temona." The engine shut off with a cough. Boots crunched on gravel. A tall American in a straw cowboy hat appeared at the tailgate, his sleeves rolled high over sun-browned arms, revealing soot-streaked forearms and a wide leather belt with tools clipped across it, cleaver, tongs, whetstone. He grinned and tipped his hat. "Welcome to the ranch, ladies." No one moved. Behind him, more men in wide hats moved with casual rhythm, tending massive iron drums set up like cannons pointed skyward, except they smoked not with death but with oakwood and hickory. Dozens of large, steel drum grills hissed and steamed in the heat, racks of ribs the size of forearms, massive briskets glistening with sauce, charred corn husks blackened and peeled back like torn uniforms, a full open-air cookout. And every single man manning the fires wore denim, boots, and a grin that didn't look like war at all. An older Japanese woman, whose fingers had once stitched field dressings on wounded sailors, muttered, "Is this punishment?" One of the younger ones, no older than 19, began to cry, but it wasn't fear. The POWs were herded, not pushed, not barked at, just gently ushered by 2 Army MPs with sidearms holstered, not drawn. The Americans made no effort to shout, no orders barked. Just hand gestures and a few slow English words. Eat, sit, okay. In the shade of the mesquites, rows of tables had been set. Not metal trays and tin cups. Real tables made of wood, plastic jugs of cold water, paper cups filled with iced tea the color of bronze, and plates, real ceramic plates, floral patterned like something from a grandmother's cabinet. Still silent, the Japanese women sat, and the cowboys served them. It was not ceremony, it was not political, it was almost careless, like they did this every weekend. The tall man with the hat, he went by Jeb, though no one gave last names out here, walked from one woman to the next, slapping heaps of meat on plates with a giant steel spatula, nodding once each time. Others handed out hot cornbread with honey butter. baked beans so thick they clung to the spoon, pickles the size of grenades, and sauce, deep red, smoky sweet, slathered like paint over everything. They didn't know what to do. One woman took a bite of brisket and froze, her mouth still half open, eyes wide. She'd eaten tree bark before. She'd gnawed boiled leather to survive on saipan. This meat dissolved on her tongue. It was sweet. It was hot. It was. She began to weep. The others saw her and slowly, carefully tasted their own. And then the quiet broke. Soft murmurs, gasps, hands trembling over utensils. No one knew how to thank the men. There was no common language, but it didn't seem to matter. The Americans just kept smiling, refilling plates without asking. One man walked by and, pointing at a jalapeno on a tray, said with a wink, "Careful now, that one bites back." When one woman coughed violently after daring a taste, a cowboy offered her a cold bottle of something. She took a sip, and her eyes went even wider. Milku. A glass bottle, thick, sweating from the ice it had been packed in. Whole milk, cold milk. There were no speeches, no flags, no symbols, just smoke, food, and heat. But something else hung in the air too, beneath the sweetness of molasses and charred pork. Something far more dangerous to military order, to enemy lines. Dignity. One of the older women, a former schoolteacher from Nagoya, dabbed her mouth with a napkin and looked out over the smoking pits and the wide blue sky. Her voice was quiet but firm. "We were not meant to see this." The others didn't respond. They didn't have to. They knew. Back in Japan, they had been taught what the Americans were. Brutes, demons, beasts in khaki who defiled everything they touched. But these cowboys, these sons of ranchers and rail workers, fed them better than they had eaten in years. And with no cameras, no propaganda, just barbecue. As the sun dipped lower and the cicadas began to fade, a guitar started up somewhere. Not a record, a real one, faint, off-key but warm. Somewhere in the middle of the tables, someone began to laugh. Not mockery, not hysteria. Relief. The kind that doesn't come when the war ends. The kind that comes when, for a few stolen hours, you forget it ever existed. And in the distance, beneath the rust-red horizon and the slow drift of mesquite smoke, the sound of boots on dry dirt grew louder. Because the cowboys weren't done. They were bringing dessert. The sun was sliding down now, slowly bleeding into the dust. It stretched the shadows of trees until they looked like thin hands reaching across the grove. The plates had been scraped clean, some licked bare when no one was looking. Bits of brisket fat and cornbread crumbs stuck to napkins like battlefield shrapnel, faint, vanishing evidence of something that hadn't felt real. The Japanese women sat still. Some leaned back on their benches with eyes closed, holding paper cups of iced tea to their foreheads. Others clutched their stomachs, overwhelmed not from pain, but from fullness. Actual foreign fullness. The kind they hadn't known in years. The kind you forget is even possible after a diet of half-rotted rice and boiled weeds. The younger ones giggled in hushed tones, pointing at the cowboy boots and wide-brimmed hats as if describing some odd parade. The older women watched more cautiously, not with fear, but with guarded, deliberate detachment, as if their minds were still trying to catch up to their bodies. Then came the sound. Metal trays clinking. One of the Texans, stocky, freckled, and sunburnt from the neck down, came waddling up holding a giant aluminum pan with steam rolling off the top. His other hand gripped a stack of shallow bowls. Behind him, 2 more cowboys followed, each carrying tubs the size of artillery shells. The first cowboy pointed to the table, winked, and dropped the pan with a theatrical flair. "Y'all saved room, right?" Of course, they didn't understand the words. But when he pulled the lid back, and the smell hit, their reaction didn't need translation. Sugar. Warm, sticky sugar, browned butter, cinnamon, molasses, soft fruit stewed into molten gold. It was as if the smoke had shifted gears, trading fire for heat and spice for sweetness. Peach cobbler. Behind him, the others placed tubs of something even stranger, a soft, pale yellow mass that shimmered slightly under the setting sun. Thick, cold, creamy. Vanilla ice cream. The women stared at the cold substance in shock, like someone had cut a piece of the moon and dropped it into a steel bucket. Ice. In this heat. It hadn't rained in days, and even the dirt looked thirsty. No one moved. One woman whispered, "A trap." The same older nurse who'd first cried over the brisket shook her head. Slowly, she reached for the spoon offered to her. She watched the cowboy scoop a ladle of cobbler into a bowl, then place a thick dollop of ice cream on top. It sizzled slightly on contact, the cold cream melting against the hot crust. He handed it to her with a nod, no words. She held it in both hands like it was glass. Another woman beside her copied the move, but her spoon trembled before reaching her mouth. She dipped in, tasted, and froze. Sweetness. Soft peaches, spiced and stewed, wrapped in pastry that flaked like old paper and tasted of butter. And that ice cream, it didn't feel like food. It felt like cheating, like eating a cloud that somehow came out of a cow. She blinked hard. This wasn't even a meal anymore. It was luxury. One by one, the other women gave in, quiet gasps, a few open-mouthed moans, and some unexpectedly began to laugh, not nervously, not out of shame. They laughed like women, not prisoners, not enemies, just women, in a foreign place, eating something so far removed from anything in their old world that the absurdity broke their composure. They had been through things none of these cowboys could imagine: shellings, starvation, rape, marches, loss. They had seen mothers bury their children and children cry themselves to sleep, but no one had ever handed them warm dessert and cold ice cream under a sunset sky. This didn't feel like mercy. It felt like trespassing into someone else's heaven. As the bowls emptied and seconds were served without question, the guitar returned. But this time, it wasn't just plucking strings. It was a song. The notes came soft at first, twangy, almost apologetic. Then a voice joined in, deep, low, and cracked from years of cigarettes and cattle dust. He sang in English, words the women didn't know, but the melody carried something ancient in it. Longing, distance, maybe even sorrow. The language didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet it drew. No one chewed anymore. They just listened, heads tilted, fingers resting on the edge of wooden tables. The sun was almost gone now, casting a halo of orange over the horizon. The words reached one of the older women as she closed her eyes, imagining the voice not as an enemy, but as something from home, if home had never gone to war. Then finally, a voice among them spoke. "Why?" she said. It was more of a plea than a question. Jeb, the tall cowboy with the hat, was standing nearby, sipping from a metal thermos. He glanced over, raising his eyebrows. The woman gestured slowly, hands open, a gesture of disbelief. Her voice cracked. "Why this?" Jeb didn't answer right away. He looked out across the grove, where a few other American soldiers sat on tailgates, fiddling with harmonicas or tossing horseshoes in the dust. He chewed the inside of his cheek. Then he walked over and crouched down beside her. "I figure you've seen plenty of hell," he said, slow and clear, knowing she probably understood none of it. "And I ain't here to add more." He tapped the bowl in front of her. "Texas don't do hate real well, but we do barbecue." She didn't understand the words, but the tone, the softness in his voice. That she understood. He tipped his hat again and stood. Across the grove, the Army sergeant in charge of the camp logistics, Staff Sergeant Callahan, checked his clipboard. Supplies from Fort Sam Houston had been more generous than expected. Plenty of meat still in cold storage. The Red Cross had even donated 3 extra tubs of ice cream meant for officers in Dallas. They rerouted it to Gainesville. Some officer said, "Hell, give the girls a treat." He didn't realize what he'd started. That night the women were driven back to their quarters, not barracks but long, single-story wooden cabins lined with bunk beds and screened windows. There were no locks on the doors, just screened doors with worn hinges. The guards didn't follow them inside. The lights stayed on. Electricity, a privilege most of their homes in Japan hadn't had in years. Inside the cabin, the women didn't sleep immediately. Some still held their spoons. Others quietly opened notebooks or scrap paper, writing things down not about war, not names of lost husbands, but recipes, best they could remember, descriptions of the sauce, the crust, the milk. They whispered in small groups, comparing flavors, trying to reconstruct what they'd just experienced. "I tasted ginger," one said. "No, it was cinnamon." "Brown sugar." "I think molasses." "My grandmother used to make something with roasted chestnuts. This was similar, but not." "But not sad," another whispered. That stopped them. It wasn't just the food. It was the absence of punishment, no mocking, no boots on necks, no humiliation. And it was dangerous. Because it made them think. One of the younger women, no more than 18, sat upright in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. After a long pause, she said something that made the whole room go quiet. "What if we were wrong?" The silence deepened. They didn't answer, because no one had an answer. But they didn't reject the question either. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. A few cabins down, a cowboy laughed, loud, rough, harmless. And in the morning, the smoke would rise again. Because the pitmasters had something else planned. The morning came not with bugles or boots stomping gravel, but with the sound of sizzling. It was faint at first, like wind in dry grass, but it grew stronger with each passing second. A rhythmic hiss broken by sharp pops. The women stirred from their bunks with groggy confusion, many of them still half lost in dreams of peaches and cold milk. The Texas sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but light was already bleeding through the gaps in the cabin windows, pale and pink. Yukiko, the former clerk from Hiroshima, pressed her face to the screen and squinted toward the grove. Smoke, again, but thinner this time. Not the heavy, dark plumes of yesterday's barbecue pits, but pale wisps drifting lazily above a smaller fire. The smell followed moments later. Not meat. Bread. She slipped on her sandals and stepped outside. A few others followed, some clutching shawls or wrapping themselves in military-issued blankets. The air was cool and dry, but charged with the same strange tension as the day before. Not fear, anticipation. The women walked in a quiet group down the dusty path toward the grove. There they found Jeb and 3 other cowboys working over a flat-top griddle the size of a dining table, balanced on rusted steel drums. Cast-iron pans hissed with thick cuts of bacon and sausage. A tin pot the size of a helmet bubbled with something creamy. Biscuits lined a baking sheet, swelling under the heat like rising clouds. And beside all of it, dozens of eggs cracking one by one into bowls by a man who looked like he'd been born with a spatula in his hand. "Look who's up early," Jeb said, flashing a grin and wiping sweat from his brow. His voice came low, friendly, like someone greeting neighbors at a porch rather than enemy combatants. The women said nothing, but their faces, wary, confused, hungry, said enough. They were waved toward the benches again. Fresh paper plates. Cold canteens refilled with orange juice. Some of the cowboys had cleaned up a bit more today, fresh shirts, belts polished. One even had a flower tucked behind his ear, and another tried to comb his hair, though the wind ruined it instantly. Without orders, without guards barking, the women sat again. Breakfast was served. Fluffy biscuits cracked open to reveal steam and butter. Scrambled eggs cooked low and slow, yellow as Texas sunflowers. Gravy, thick, peppered, and poured generously. Bacon so crisp it snapped in two when tapped. Sweet sausage dripping juices that stained the paper plates. The disbelief had worn off slightly. This time, the women dug in faster. The hesitation of yesterday was replaced by something more primal, something they didn't even realize had been stolen from them long ago. Hunger without shame. Across the grove, a few American soldiers not part of the cowboy crew watched from a distance, arms crossed, whispering among themselves. "You think they even appreciate it?" one asked. Another older shook his head. "That ain't the point." By the end of breakfast, Yukiko looked down at her empty plate, then up at Jeb as he walked past. She stood shakily and bowed, not formally, not militarily, but low and long, her eyes cast downward. Jeb paused. Then he took off his hat and did something that stunned every Japanese woman at the table. He bowed back. It wasn't perfect, too stiff, too quick, but it was unmistakable. A cowboy bowing to a prisoner of war. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rustling through the mesquites. Later that afternoon, after the heat had settled into its usual oppressive rhythm, the trucks came again, but this time not to relocate. The women were told to gather by the road, where half a dozen army flatbeds had arrived, each carrying something unexpected: bales of hay, saddles, and horses. Real horses. Not military, not parade-ready. Ranch horses, dusty, worn, but strong. Some of the women stepped back in alarm. They had seen horses in war, animals screaming under shell fire, bodies twisted on roads, horses meant for pulling supply carts through mud and blood. But these creatures were different, their eyes calm, their coats groomed. One even wore a garland of rope flowers. The cowboys dismounted and began unloading supplies. Ropes, saddles, canteens, a guitar. Callahan stepped forward and clapped his hands once. He pointed to the horses and motioned toward the women, then to the cowboys, then made a slow, circling motion in the air. "Ride," he said. "Today y'all learn to ride." The women looked at each other, bewildered. Some laughed outright, thinking it was a joke. One of them said flatly, "We're prisoners. They want to parade us." But it wasn't a show. The cowboys began walking the horses around slowly, letting the women approach and touch their flanks. No rush, no barking orders, just invitation. A young woman named Noriko, who hadn't spoken since her arrival from Saipan, reached out and touched the muzzle of a chestnut mare. The animal huffed gently, leaning into her palm. The cowboy holding the reins handed her a helmet. "You're up," he said. 10 minutes later, Noriko was in the saddle, eyes wide, both hands gripping the pommel like it might buck at any moment. But the mare was gentle, walking slow as molasses. The cowboy walked beside her, one hand on the reins, speaking soft, patient words. Soon others followed. By sunset, nearly half the women had taken turns, some laughing, others weeping. A few stared off into the horizon from atop the saddle, silent and wind-kissed, as if imagining another life. Yukiko rode last. She didn't want to, but Jeb wouldn't let her refuse, not out of force, out of challenge. "You watched every single one of them ride," he said. "That ain't fair, horse is waitin'." She mounted, awkward and stiff. The saddle felt alien under her. But the moment the horse began moving, something in her spine loosened. She swayed gently, back straight, hair fluttering. No guards, no fences, just dirt, wind, and sky. When she dismounted, her legs shook, but her smile didn't. That night the fire pits roared again, but not with meat. With music. A full band this time. 5 cowboys with instruments borrowed from a nearby church. Fiddle, banjo, steel guitar, harmonica, and a battered old upright bass. They set up near the grove and began playing something fast and foot-stomping. The women didn't understand the lyrics, but they understood joy, laughter, rhythm. One cowboy began clapping in rhythm, encouraging them to join. A few women hesitated, then one stood, then two, then five. It wasn't a dance, not at first. Just swaying, smiling. Then someone twirled, then another, and before long the grove became something no prison had ever seen. A hoedown. Not wild, not theatrical, just free. A cowboy took Noriko's hand and spun her once. She shrieked in surprise and laughter. Even Yukiko swayed side to side. Her hands never left her sides, but her feet tapped in rhythm. Jeb sat nearby, watching it all with his boots kicked up on a hay bale. He took a slow sip from his canteen, then looked over at Callahan. "They're starting to forget." Callahan raised a brow. "Forget what?" Jeb nodded toward the firelight and the dancing prisoners. "That they're supposed to hate us." The sergeant didn't respond. But he didn't deny it either. At midnight the music faded. The fires were doused. The women returned to their bunks, not under guard but walking at their own pace. They whispered and laughed the whole way back. But inside, when the lights were off, silence fell again. And with it a terrifying thought. If these men, these enemies, could be kind, then what had been true? What else had been a lie? No one said it aloud. But they all felt it. And tomorrow, the Cowboys had one last surprise. The next morning, there was no smoke. No smell of sizzling bacon or wood-fired coals. No distant thrum of guitar strings. The grove stood quiet, the fire pits cold, the benches empty. The women awoke to the stillness with unease, not fear, but the eerie tension that comes when a dream doesn't repeat. Had it ended? Had command stepped in? Had someone from Washington finally realized prisoners were being treated like honored guests? Yukiko stepped out of her cabin barefoot, squinting into the rising Texas sun, and saw no trucks, no fire, no Jeb. Just wind. Just that endless rust-colored dirt stretching toward the tree line. She wasn't the only one outside. The other women slowly emerged, blinking, whispering. Some held tin cups of warm water. Others looked toward the grove as if expecting the spell to resume. But it didn't. Until around mid-morning, the sound returned. Not smoke, not music. Engines. 3 jeeps, not army green but dusty blue and tan, rolled down the ridge from the western road. Their tops were off. In each one sat a cowboy, not in uniform, no guns. Just dusty jeans, rolled sleeves, and sunglasses that gleamed like mirrors under the rising sun. The lead jeep stopped in front of the first cabin. Jeb got out. He said nothing, just walked around to the back of the jeep and opened the tailgate. Inside were boxes, not crates, boxes tied with red twine, some wrapped in newspaper, others in brown paper bags. On the side of one, a hand-drawn smiley face and the word "ladies" scrawled in thick blue crayon. One by one, the Cowboys began delivering them. To each cabin, no explanation. Inside, the women found things they couldn't process. Toothbrushes with soft bristles, soap that smelled of lavender, hairbrushes, combs, not military issue but real ones, a small mirror, powdered makeup, unused sealed American brands they'd never seen, fabric cotton, floral, patterned enough to sew dresses, a sewing kit with real thread, real needles. And at the bottom of each box, a book. Different for each woman. Some were novels, Mark Twain, Louisa May Alcott, even a few westerns. One woman found a gardening guide. Another, a cookbook titled The Joy of Cooking, with a note tucked inside that read in shaky handwriting, "My mama's favorite. Thought y'all might like it." There were no orders to accept, no instructions. The Cowboys just handed the boxes over and left. By noon, the women were sitting in clusters, inspecting their haul, laughing, marveling, even painting each other's nails using a tiny bottle of polish someone had somehow included in a care package. But the biggest surprise came after lunch. when Callahan gathered them under the old mesquite tree near the pit site. He stood with his hands behind his back, squinting at a clipboard. "All right," he said slowly, "got word from San Antonio." The translator, an army nurse who spoke basic Japanese, stepped forward and repeated the words as best she could. "Word from San Antonio," she said. "You are being moved." The group went dead silent. San Antonio, moved. Had they crossed a line? Were they being sent to isolation now? Was this all just a test? The sergeant raised a hand. "Not like that." He pointed to a long white tent that had been set up overnight on the far side of the field. "You're not being transferred, you're being seen. By doctors, dentists, optometrists, full exam, new orders from command. They're sending down a mobile unit." More silence. Yukiko stepped forward, hesitant. "Why?" she asked in English. It was slow, careful, but clear. Callahan blinked, surprised. "You're human," he replied. "Ain't that enough?" It wasn't an answer that made sense in wartime. But it made sense out here. The tent had been outfitted with cots, privacy curtains, and rows of medical equipment. By late afternoon, each woman was seen by an army medic, most of them female. Teeth were checked, eyes examined, minor infections treated, rashes, malnutrition. Some were given vitamins, others prescribed creams. One woman had a lump under her arm checked so thoroughly she broke down in tears. She'd hidden it for months, convinced it was cancer. It was just a swollen lymph node. When the checkups ended, they were given fresh clothes, not uniforms. Dresses. Simple cotton sundresses in soft colors. Pale blue, cream, rose, no insignia, no numbers, just fabric and ribbon ties. Shoes too, sturdy leather, hand-me-downs from wives of soldiers who donated to a local church. When Yukiko saw herself in the mirror, a real mirror, not a sheet of polished tin, she gasped. Not at the woman in the glass, but at the realization. She looked like herself again. The others noticed too. That night, as the sun dipped low and the earth turned orange, the grove lit up once more. But this time it wasn't just a meal, it was something else. A farewell. The Cowboys set up a long table covered in checkered cloth. No benches tonight, just hay bales arranged in a circle. A makeshift stage had been erected, some plywood on crates. The band returned, this time with amplifiers rigged from army radios and extension cords that snaked back toward the medical tent. Yukiko sat between Noriko and the older schoolteacher, Ryuko, all three in clean dresses, hair combed, lips lightly colored with gloss smuggled in from somewhere. They didn't feel like prisoners. They felt like guests. Jeb stood at the center of the grove, holding a plate of ribs and a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. "Now I know y'all don't speak a lick of Texan," he said, tipping his hat, "but I figure food talks louder than words." The translator beside him repeated the words, smiling. "Food speaks loud," she said, "even louder than guns." A cheer went up from the Cowboys. Then the music started. They served ribs again, of course, and coleslaw, baked beans, but also watermelon, sliced cold, sweet and glistening, and lemonade in tall glasses poured from mason jars packed with ice. As the women ate, the band played a tune none of them knew but all of them could feel. A fiddle sang like a voice on the wind, and the harmonica joined like distant thunder. Noriko leaned over to Yukiko and said something she hadn't said in weeks. "I don't want to go." Yukiko didn't answer. Because she didn't either. As darkness fell, lanterns strung between trees flickered to life. The night smelled of citrus and wood smoke. Coyotes howled again in the far hills, and the stars came out, one by one, like silver pinholes in a velvet sky. The final gift came near midnight. A group of cowboys began passing out paper envelopes. Inside each one, a photograph. A real one. Taken earlier that week by an army photographer assigned to document morale at the camp. They had printed one for every woman. Most of the photos showed them smiling, laughing. By February 1946, most of the women were repatriated. The war was over, Japan surrendered, and the paperwork had begun. The women, like all POWs, were processed, interviewed, questioned, cleared. And then one by one, they were sent home. But they were not the same. Yukiko returned to Hiroshima. Her home was gone, her family scattered, but she had her recipe. She opened a tea house, then a diner, then something in between. Her specialty: barbecue, Japanese style. She never explained it to her customers, never told them about the Cowboys or the peaches or the guitar beneath the Texas stars. But she kept a photo on the wall, a black and white image. A group of Japanese women seated at a long wooden table laughing, plates of ribs and corn and coleslaw before them, a tall cowboy in the background, hat tipped, grin wide. No one ever asked who he was. And she never told. She just smiled and flipped the meat. Because food didn't need explanations. It just needed to be shared. Years later, when Yukiko's granddaughter found the old folded paper recipe tucked inside a worn copy of The Joy of Cooking, she asked, "Grandma, what is this?" Yukiko stared at it a long time. Then she took the paper gently, smoothed it out, and smiled softly. "It's a map," she said. "To where?" the girl asked. Yukiko's eyes drifted to the window, where the wind stirred the curtains and the smell of simmering sauce filled the air. "To a place you'd never expect," she whispered. "A place called Texas."